And this next chapter I'm going to be introducing on my bicycle, riding around on the snowmobile trails just outside the Morrisville campus. See you there. Hi, I'm biking the snowmobile trails today. Welcome to week 3, chapter 3. Today we're going to take a look at chapter 3 in the textbook, which is largely about the change in U.S. drug laws from the 1900s to the current period, 2020s. So the chapter opens with a discussion of the 19th century, the 1800s, and how people treated drugs at that time. And that was largely with very little federal interference. Really no federal interference. There were no drug laws for the United States coming from the federal government until 1906. The very first federal drug law went into place was 1906. So that begins an era which I'm going to call the first regime. The first regime of drug laws that started to control drugs, to see them as so-called controlled substances in the U.S. And the reason that came about was, well, there were 3 reasons. The first reason had to do with the toxicity, and particularly the fact that people were putting toxic drugs into what are called patent medicines. Patent medicines. These were things like what today we might just call cough syrups, or maybe a lozenge for a toothache or something. But they extended well beyond that into the addition of certain, what today would be certainly considered controlled drugs like opium or cocaine. They would put into wines and liquors and sell as a potent cough medicine. They would put cocaine in toothache drops. They would even put opium in children's medicine, young children, infants' medicine, to stop croup and whooping cough and so forth. And while these medicines may have been somewhat effective, they could have been dangerous. They were dangerous, in fact. And especially they were dangerous when manufacturers didn't reveal that they were putting these very potent drugs into their medicines. So because of those patent medicines, that was one reason why the first regime of federal drug laws began. A second reason had to do with the fact that new drugs were starting to appear in America that had not really been widely known. This was the result of first new trade relationships and new technologies of trade, faster shipping and so forth. The maintenance of global trade was one reason, but also it had to do with the fact that there were a lot of immigrants coming to the United States, and they were bringing, in some cases, their own medicines and controlled substances, well, not controlled at that time, but they were to become controlled soon thereafter. I'm thinking particularly of Chinese immigration to the West Coast. Many Chinese immigrants were moving to work in gold mines in California, or to work on the Union Pacific Railroad, or in other capacities. And they were bringing opium with them. And that opium started to spread more widely than the Chinese community, of course, and for that reason, one of the first opium laws went into effect in 1914. At the same time, there was a widespread belief that cocaine, which had been used fairly widely in the US, but typically as a medicine, not as a recreational drug. Cocaine, it was believed, this is not true, but it was believed that this was causing a crime epidemic in the South, especially amongst southern black populations. You can click on those links in the notes to get much more information and a short video from Big Think about that opium and cocaine introduction, I guess you could call it, in the late 19th century in the US. Well, this led to the second law of the first regime of drug control in the US, the second federal law, and that was the Harrison Act. Oop, back on the bike here. There we go. The Harrison Act. The Harrison Act was designed specifically to control the spread of cocaine and opium by creating the mandate of a prescription for physicians, and this is one of the first times prescriptions started to become mandated by the federal government if you're a doctor or pharmacist. And it also increased penalties. Now, there was no drug enforcement agency at the time. All of these laws that were starting to come into effect were being governed over by the enforcement branch of the American government, and that's of course the executive branch, which has its cabinets. Its cabinets are the departments that we're familiar with. Department of the Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, Department of Treasury, so forth. These drug laws were overseen by the Department of Treasury because the largest penalty, really, early on at least, was to introduce a tax penalty if one violated these laws. So, that's those are the first two drug laws that were really important in the American federal government. Now remember, state governments and local governments had their own laws going back all the way to the beginning of the country. But with the federal administration getting involved, this brought much more power and teeth to the drug laws that were starting to come into effect. And it gave more power to the FBI, the IRS, Department of Treasury, and even the Department of Agriculture, because of course drugs and plants go hand in hand, right? So that was what was going on at the beginning of the first regime. Later on in the first regime, up until roughly 1969, there were a number of other laws that were put into effect to guarantee the purity, effectiveness, and safety of drugs. Look at the textbook in this chapter at the examples of elixir sulfonamide, which was a drug that killed 107 people, I believe, prior to its being banned and controlled. And there was another drug that was in 1938, I believe, that the law was passed called the which one was that? Not the Kefauver-Harris Act, that was 1962, but 38. It'll come to me. All right, so you can look that up in the text and in the notes. I'm doing all this out of memory. But in 1962, there was another incident that really spiked the worry of federal officials, and that was an issue with a drug called thalidomide, which was being used for morning sickness for pregnant women, and appeared safe at first, but then after many trials and many unfortunate incidences in West Germany, where it was considered legal and used widely, it turned out that the drug did lead to significant birth defects in children. And so obviously using it for pregnant women was not to be recommended. So the fact that these drugs weren't as safe as was once thought and did not have effectiveness perhaps for what they were claiming to have effectiveness for led these new laws to be passed. a number of other laws, including in 1937 the Marijuana Tax Act, and others throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, led to a kind of a huge array, as mass of drug laws that were considered to get more and more confusing on the part of the agents of control. This was, again, Department of Treasury, typically in the FBI, as well as kind of contradicting each other. And this, by the time the late 60s emerged, with whole new drugs coming into play, like LSD, for example, which wasn't invented until the 1940s, these new drugs and new laws all got quite confusing. So the federal government in 1969 decided to throw everything out and start fresh. And that starts the second regime of drug laws in the U.S. And that second regime, I'm going to call it the Controlled Substances Regime, is defined by the 1970s, the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. And that is a set of new drug laws that introduced a whole new agency to oversee the laws. That agency was the DEA, yes, the Drug Enforcement Agency, that agency that we have today that oversees all drug laws. So we have the DEA introduced. We have new penalties, 15-year penalties for possession of controlled substances. And perhaps most importantly, the whole new schedule, they call it, of drugs that are defined to be by three qualities, to be either heavily controlled or lightly controlled. The schedule or categories of these drugs range from Schedule 1, Category 1, to Category 5. Category 1 is considered the drugs that have the least medical utility, no use for medicine, that have a high likelihood of dependence, and that may carry some toxic effects that could lead to perhaps death or overdose. It could be harmful. So harmfulness, medical utility, and degree of dependence forming are the three qualities that define whether a drug should be on Schedule 1, the worst, so-called worst drugs, or Schedule 5, the drugs that are less likely to cause harm. So, take a look at that schedule that's in the notes. I have a few examples there. For example, LSD, heroin, they are on Schedule 1. No medical utility for heroin because we have morphine and other opiate drugs that are used for medicine. LSD doesn't seem to have medical utility, although today there is a lot of discussion about the psychological, psychotherapeutic effects of hallucinogenic drugs. But essentially, this new regime also puts marijuana in Category 1, one of the worst drugs, and it remained there until very recently, just this past January, I believe. It might have been December or November, but very recently, just a few months ago, the Trump administration changed the category of marijuana to Schedule 3, or recommended that. I'm not sure if the change has been made yet. But I find that very interesting because it just shows how the way in which the drugs were categorized was not truly dependent on scientific evidence. It was more likely to be a result of how the drugs were seen in society rather than what we know they did, specifically regarding medical utility, the potential for harm and overdose, and the potential for dependency. This new drug regime also links to the so-called war on drugs. This was really the beginning in 1973 of the modern-day war on drugs, which has really characterized most of my lifetime, certainly most of yours. And that is something we'll talk at greater length about throughout the course. But it's important to recognize that this so-called war on drugs is directly linked to the second regime of drug control in the United States, starting in 1970 with the Controlled Substances Act. Okay, I'm going to go on with the Chapter 3 readings from High Price, 3 and 4, in just a moment. So see you back on my skis for that segment. Be well. High Price book. We've got Carl Hart growing up in many ways. In Chapter 3, Big Mama this week, he talks about his home life and school. He gives a good description of the racial inequality that existed in Florida in the 1980s and exists still today in many places. And when it comes to schooling and attitudes about children, he was one of the first schools in that region of Florida to integrate, where that became a mandate by the state as a result of course, much earlier, the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in the 1950s. So some history there, but more importantly, some personal experience from him regarding kind of, I guess you could call it, racial attitudes in the mostly white school that he went to, that he was bused to as a result of integration. He found solace in athletics. He did well in math, but generally was a pretty average student, or considered one by his teachers, and had to prove himself. The following chapter, he gets into a discussion of sex education, you could call it. That's the title of the chapter. And that discussion, I think, is most important when you get to the end of the chapter, especially page 74 if you're reading the trade paperback. Very important page, which describes his attention to the so-called dopamine hypothesis that emerged in the 1990s, that he was somewhat taken with as a scholar and researcher, and how today, in writing that book, he says it was a much too simplistic explanation for drug dependence and drug addiction. Also pay attention to how he frames the ideas of dependence and addiction, and how addiction is too simplistic a term to really capture the subtleties and complexities of a dependent person, and all the different qualities that can exist in that category of dependence in terms of history, experience, and outcomes. So that, I think, is a great lesson to take out of the end of that chapter. Read that.
All right, that's it for this week. Back in front of the fireplace, staying warm. Hope you're staying warm too. Don't forget the assignments this week. They are to do the quiz by Thursday, do your discussion and the online media homework by Sunday. And if you're in the SOCI 370 section doing the research paper, you have a concept paper due on Sunday as well. We'll have our bi-weekly journal next week on chapters 3 through 5 of High Price. All right, signing off for now. Oh, one last thing. If you're confused about whether you're in SOCI 270 or SOCI 370, don't worry about the title of the course saying 270. That is that's a administrative error. I'm working with the Brightspace operations people to get that to read 270, 370. So that is not an indicator of what course you are in. If you're confused, email me and I'll let you know directly which one you're registered for. Okay, thank you. Have a great week. Take care.